is Mirel Stelian. I'm a health economist and health tech expert. I worked at the Israeli Ministry of Health and at the Health Fund Leumit. Last year I moved to Denmark, and now as a consultant for Triple Ventures, I work on supporting startups and collaborations with the Israeli ecosystem, like this webinar. I'll be the moderator of this webinar today and presenting the speakers and your questions. You can see on your screen the program for today. After the assembly and introduction to the webinar, we'll have two people that you know really well. Yoav Fisher, the head of technological innovation at the HealthIL digital health community. He will be speaking about their activity in the field of digital health and health tech. Then we'll have Shomrat Shurtz, the Senior Director of Business Development at the Israeli Innovation Authority. She will be speaking about their activity in the field of digital health and opportunities and funding for startups. Then our main lecture is by Dr. Stefan Walzer, our guest. He is a German digital health reimbursement expert, health economist, CEO and founder of Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy in Germany. He will be speaking about how German digital health reimbursement pathways offer a unique opportunity to get in reimbursement with a digital health concept while developing the full evidence package. Afterwards, at around 2:45, we'll have questions and answers. You are welcome to write your questions throughout the webinar. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, so we will not miss any of your questions. You are also welcome to send your questions or contact any of the participants after this event at these emails that I'll be sharing in the chat in a moment. One question that we already got also before the webinar is there will be a recording of this webinar. We will be sharing it and publishing it on the Mars YouTube channel. So now you have the floor is yours. I'll now share your slides.
Oh, I can share.
Ah, okay. So
yeah, I'll share. It's
okay.
Easier.
Okay. Sure.
Okay. Ta-da. Okay. Does everyone see what I see?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I want to go over this quickly. Most of you know me, most of you not, but I'm assuming most of you know me. I'll explain briefly about HealthIL and then some things we see here. And then I want to pass it off to Shomrat and Dr. Walzer for the bulk. So HealthIL is the digital health ecosystem. We work in conjunction with a lot of governmental entities. But at the core of it, what we try to do is to integrate technology into the healthcare system and do this by starting first and foremost with the organizations that are interested in the technology, hospitals, MOs, pharma companies. And we do them two main things, an assessment of what the real need challenges are, and then an assessment of how they operate, what can they offer the startup. And on the other end of this is the solutions, right? The startups. Some solution comes from a technological company like NVIDIA or AWS. We like to work holistically across the entire ecosystem, moving up to governmental friends and downstream to accelerators and investors, incubate, etc. So we should all know this by now. I'll go over it very quickly. Israel has tons of the key technical core components of healthcare innovation, which is great. Proven culture of innovation. More critically, that isn't spoken about is that there's a critical density of technical talent. The revolving door between industries is a huge reason for the influx in startups. There's also a very unique infrastructure for ideation of healthcare solutions. This over here on the right, you can see the growth in the number of digital health startups. I can tell you that already now at the end of 2021, I have already passed 1,000 in our internal little CRM. Under the hood, there's a couple of things that are driving this, right? The government, healthcare organizations, industry and corporate, the ecosystem, and money, obviously. So Israel is unique in that there are a number of national initiatives that are helping push forward ideation healthcare technology. Digital Israel, Shomrat from the Innovation Authority, there's large national projects, etc. What's interesting that sometimes isn't get spoken about is that the healthcare organizations themselves are also a critical component. Innovation management as a concept is becoming more and more formalized within the hospitals. And today, even the smaller hospitals that we work with have a dedicated person who deals with innovation. Access is another big one. We in Israel are very fortunate to be able to get access to everybody, which is great. So it reduces barrier to entry. And there's also incentive for these hospitals to do piloting. Another big bonus is that all of the industry players, specifically in technology, have a footprint here in Israel and are expanding their activities regarding healthcare innovation. More and more, I'm seeing that Israel is seen as a local and potentially global innovation hub. And there's lots of money, right? We should all know this by now. Of course, it's challenging always to fundraise. Of course, there are still funding gaps, but on the whole, Israel actually has quite a lot of money in general. So for healthcare, you can see VC investments per capita is bigger than the United States and Israel. And then there's a lot of support from the ecosystem, accelerators, etc. What I do want to point out is that all of this is great, but succeeding in healthcare innovation, in my opinion, is involved with a couple of different moving things, right? Everyone wants to improve health, but you also need to at least not harm and hopefully improve existing workflows, and you at least not harm and hopefully improve existing healthcare economics. What I see a lot in Israel, everyone's improving health in one way or another. But these two are questions. And it's very hard to understand the nuances outside of Israel of workflow and healthcare economics. Who's paying for what and why? That, for those who know me, is a big passion of mine, is understanding that. But on top of that, there's also policy, right? Regulation is different and regulation is constantly changing. My point of this briefing is that policy can also be seen as an opportunity, and this is what the core of the conversation will be. The new regulation in Germany, it creates complexity, but it also creates lots of opportunities. And I think that there's quite a lot of opportunities, specifically in Germany, based on the new DIGA regulation, specifically regarding reimbursement pathways and how to make money as a digital health tool. So with that, my 5 minutes are up. Shomrat, I'm going to give it over to you. And thank you very much.
So I promised to be very short, approximately 5 minutes, in which I should conclude a budget of the Israeli Innovation Authority of over 800 million euros per year. So what we do at the Israeli Innovation Authority, in accordance to the digital health and the digital health regulation here, is divided upon the different stages of the idea, of the project. It begins with the first entrepreneur that wakes up in the morning and has a brilliant idea about how to improve the health or the health tech, and we can support him in a smaller amount of money. Then it goes to a bigger budget, up to 15 million shekels, which is around, I think, 4 million euros per year per an idea. Again, everything is per a project. The next step would be a pilot program, and the pilot program is part of the Israeli program, which combines what Yoav has described earlier, the Israeli Ministry of Health with the Digital Israel and the Israel Innovation Authority. It's a national plan, and the pilot program is one of the major tools which we work with. In this program, we support companies, Israeli ideas, the IP should stay here, which have a more advanced project, the TRL, Technology Readiness Level, of 6 to 8. It should be already done, produced, and it goes to its pilot inside the health organization. Up till today, upon 3.5 years, we already are supporting together with our partners at the Israeli Health Ministry, over 60 projects of digital health in Israel. And the beauty of this program is not only the support and the introducing the new digital, device or algorithm into the Israeli health system, but also working together with the regulators to make sure that this new innovative idea is harvesting and being introduced properly into the systems, although the hurdles are really hard. So some of my partners are here in the list of participants, and they can confirm that I think we work really closely with the regulator to make sure things happen. Last stage of support would be the infrastructure themselves. And we are about to launch, again, the Israeli Health Minister, together with the Israeli Innovation Authority, a very big program regarding the infrastructure for digital health within the health organizations themselves. All of those things come together with the lab, with the innovation lab, and several more tools that I don't have enough time to discuss. And I urge all of you to ask for support from the Israeli Innovation Authority. We are here to support you and to help all the entrepreneurs and companies submit for all these paths. So Mirel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shomrat. The main lecture today by Dr. Walzer. I'm going to give a bit of a longer introduction since it's new to most of the people here. Dr. Walzer has roughly 20 years of experience in reimbursement and pricing, and is the founder and CEO of Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy that is based in Germany. He is a member of various societies, including the German Heads Association of Digital Healthcare. He received MSc in economics and PhD from the University of Zurich, and a diploma in clinical trials from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Dr. Walzer also teaches reimbursement and pricing for digital health applications at German universities. Dr. Walzer, the floor is yours, and thank you again.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mirel. Thank you also for the introduction and the very interesting kind of insights into some of the parts in the Israel healthcare system. I'll come back to that as well when I present some of the, let's say, starting points, especially in the German context, where I've just seen that, Yoav, I think you have presented obviously DIGA as an opportunity, but also including complexity. Fully agree. We'll see that in the next couple of minutes. And Shomrat, I was very impressed by the numbers you have presented as well, and the different kind of, let's say, opportunities as well in terms of pathways, which might be even possible to launch a digital health solution into the Israeli healthcare system. So let's just see whether the new digital healthcare pathway is really a way to follow, as Yoav has suggested, or whether it's maybe something to discard.
May I just, thank you. May I just add to all the attendees, you're welcome to write your questions in the Q&A throughout the next lecture. So at the end of it, we'll answer these questions.
Yeah, very good point, Mirel. Yes, thank you. Also very quickly, and a quicker promotion from our side. I mean, we're also heading the Market Access podcast MAP, and we just had the latest episode, which was at the beginning of October, which was exactly 1 year of DiGAs. So just maybe if you're interested, it's roughly 30 minutes long, and I think it gives quite good insights also by Dr. Gaia. She's the head of association of the Digital Healthcare Society, and also Professor Matusiewicz, who is one of the core stakeholders also in terms of digital health in Germany. But now let's just focus a bit, and we just start, let's say, by introducing, I think Germany is probably really quite interesting, let's say, also in terms of not only number of patients, number of people, but obviously as well from the, let's say, complexity side, as I think also Yoav has just said. I mean, keeping in mind, we'll focus today quite a bit on DiGAs, which is a special digital, let's say, healthcare solution in the outpatient setting. But we still have, just in case you would, for example, have a good and interesting kind of health solution in the inpatient setting, or a solution which could be used in the in and outpatient setting. We have still roughly 2,000 hospitals in Germany. And also there you have different, let's say, kind of owners of those hospitals, which might also add further complexity. Not even that, we still have a bit more than 100 health insurance funds, which is not just, let's say, one national health system, right? Where you can probably as well quite nicely, I think in some environments at least, let's say, distribute the money and the incentives as well to further strengthen the healthcare system. But it's also sometimes a bit quite tricky because we have very small ones, some even very local ones, and it's historically given, but also obviously quite large ones, which are also acting nationwide. So that's also something keeping in mind in case, and especially if the DiGA, for example, the DiGA pathway would not apply, because the DiGA pathway is obviously the interesting part of that is especially that this is then applying on a national basis. So if you go to that and you get, let's say, the thumbs up, and we'll see how that works, you would be and have access to all statutory health insured patients, which is roughly 85% of the German population. I mean, I was just saying I was quite impressed by the numbers. And just to give you a bit of an overview to where I think we started, let's say roughly 1.5 years ago. I mean, I can still, I mean, maybe a very short story. I mean, when I was at a doctor's office at my GP, roughly 1.5 to 2 years ago, was shortly before DiGA was introduced, there was a quite nice letter outside of the physician's office where it was just stated, dear patients, we are very happy. We now just bought a second fax machine. So if you want to have a prescription, please send us a fax. Gosh, I was shocked. But then obviously we know, because we're obviously working in the digital health area, there are a lot of different, let's say, endeavors currently ongoing, right? I mean, DiGAs is one thing, but you have also seen, obviously and quite clearly, the COVID area has as well, let's say, pushed a bit for telehealth consultation, becoming a bit more the norm, not everywhere, but at least it's getting there. We have still, let's say, quite for the German environment, it's, I think, quite a good amount, even that I just heard some other numbers, let's say from Israel, where I was really impressed, but the health innovation is generally as well financially supported by 200 million euros. We also had just another quite big budget, which has been, let's say, opened for the German hospitals, which is 3 billion euros for the next 4 years as well, which is just dedicated basically to the digital health infrastructure. So this is basically, and hopefully then as well, that we might want to move away from the, I mean, we call it the paper chaos, or the kind of incentives around fax machines. And I think the DiGA pathway is one of the core components of that. So how does it look in general? We're coming to the definition of DiGA. So what is a DiGA? I mean, it's just a buzzword at the end of the day, but we need to see what it really is, right? That we can, let's say, also feel it. And what if you have a, maybe even a very interesting and quite good and evidence-based healthcare solution from a digital perspective, but it's not a DiGA, then it's quite clearly also a question how to further get into the system. There are options, and you see that on the right-hand side in the blue boxes. There are a couple of, let's say, inpatient, outpatient reimbursement, let's say, processes, quite complex in a way. They last a quite long time. And I think most of the times, if we have digital health innovations applicable and being reimbursed in the German sector, then it's normally what you see on the right-hand side, where it just says reimbursement outside of standard of care. A lot of times it's direct contracts with health insurance funds. And if you just imagine, just keep in mind what I just said beforehand, we still have a bit more than 100 health insurance funds. And if you need to get with basically everybody, with each of those health insurance funds in a way, a selective and direct contract, it takes quite a while. We only had really very few digital health innovations until, I would say, yeah, probably 2 or 3 years ago. Some really successful ones, but a lot of times only regional ones, right? We only had regional solutions. But I think the DIGA pathway and the Hospital Care Act with the 3 billion, what I've just mentioned a minute ago, I think this might just push that away into the kind of regular kind of contracting, regular reimbursement. And this is also why I think DIGA is a real good framework, hopefully then, to go. So core question, and this is always a core question if we also, let's say, first of all, start discussing together with the company, with the DIGA in their mind, some even in the early stages in terms of just starting the programming. Some have already, for example, been available and be successful in some other markets, some from Israel, some from France, some from the US, some from Australia, for example, where some of those digital health solutions are already in place. The core question always, is it really a DIGA? It sounds so evident, so obvious a lot of times, but a lot of times it's not even that, right? So it's basically 4 different categories. It's all laid out in the law and the regulations. I think that's quite clear, but just to make it quite simple and also to follow, right? That once you would be in that kind of direction to maybe decide, is it really DIGA? Could Germany be potentially a possibility, for example, to expand as well? Then you can as well quickly check if that is maybe something would resonate with your product. So first point, I think medical device class 1 or 2A, according to MDR or MDD. That's, I think, the clear number 1. So if it's a 2B or even above 2B, then it's no more being applicable for the DIGA pathway. But quite clearly, there's then the opportunity that's then dependent a bit on your evidence base from the methods evaluation process. But we put that in brackets because it's a quite long process then to get in. So just assuming you have medical device class 1 or 2A, then it's the second question, which is, again, I think a lot of times the kind of obvious thing, but I can tell you we had already some quite interesting, I would say, funny examples where people were thinking it's a digital technology, but it was not. So the main function of the DIGA needs to be mainly relying on digital technologies. So the funny examples we just had was a simple kind of data collection kind of app, right? Where you just enter your numbers and it was just saved, right? Whatever every smartphone could basically do, right? Even the simplest one. This is obviously not the digital technology. So there needs always to be something around it, right? If it's maybe a kind of mathematical kind of calculation behind, any kind of artificial intelligence, something like that needs to be in the background, right? This is important. So class 1 or 2A, plus digital technology. And then quite interestingly, also Yoav, I think you also brought that up, right? Why should the system, or in this case, yes, also the different health insurance companies basically pay for it? The economics is one thing, we'll come to that maybe, but the first point is clearly also, I mean, where is the big benefit, right? And that's then also where a lot of times, this is also a very important point, the kind of focus here is on the insured person, what is written here, right? So it needs to be something what patients can use, right? So if it's the physician monitoring the patient, it could be a tricky discussion. We have those discussions where, yes, it might make sense from a clinical, from a medical perspective to say we have an ill person, right? A patient who should be monitored by somebody who understands it, so the physician. But if it's in that way, it's rather and not a DIGA, because then it's not in the hands basically of the patient, but it's rather in the hand of the physician. Sometimes just small changes which could be implemented. I think a lot of times we have just said, look, I mean, maybe from a programming perspective, it's not so difficult to by just simply saying, look, I mean, the patient uses it. So for example, patient could get in the quality of life, any kind of complications across time with a couple of further questionnaires, for example. And once they've reached a given threshold, there's first basically kind of alarm for the patient, and they could basically then directly contact the physician, right? Either by telephone or in Germany, video consultations, not a fax machine, but that's then sometimes the read, right? It just more comes from the patient, but not directly from the physician. And for example, if the patient then allows that the physician could see how severely maybe the patient is then suddenly affected, then that's also allowed, but the patient needs to be the acting part of that. This is really important when we think about DIGAs. Otherwise, from a functionality perspective, I think the DIGA pathway is quite open, right? It could be around detection, treatment, elevation, etc. I put monitoring a bit into brackets, right? Just remember what I have just said a couple of seconds ago. I think it's important that the patient is a co-driver. Physician could be an add-on, let's say, but it needs to be the main driver by the patient. This is basically the kind of definition of a DIGA. A lot of times it's very simple to say, yes, this is a DIGA. Sometimes it's a bit more difficult. Important is those kind of questions could already as well be discussed with the so-called BfArM. Let me quickly get my laser pointer here. So just state it here. The BfArM is basically the institution in Germany which is then deciding on the inclusion of your DIGA in the so-called DIGA registry. This is in the early stages here when you say the application. The consultation is basically what I have just mentioned. If you have questions, for example, is the evidence sufficient? For example, is the digital health solution we have in our hands really a DIGA? Then you can go to the BfArM and contact them, get a consultation, which is normally a 60 to 90 minute kind of discussion directly with them. Everything fully confidential, so no worries about that. And the other interesting part, especially if you're maybe in the early stage and not exactly sure if this could be a pathway for you as a company, you could as well get that consultation English. It may be, I'm not sure, I'm not an expert in the Israel healthcare system, but that's maybe standard in Israel. In Germany, it's not. It's very much public officers thinking, right? And public officers think the official language is German. That is why it's normally only done in German. But for the DIGAs, they have changed that. And that's also, I think, one of the big opportunities. You can submit for the consultation, your consultation request in English, and even do the consultation meeting in English. So at least the first step, you can basically tick mark quite easy. If you then obviously need to go into the full submission, then this needs to be as well in German. So the kind of core point here is especially, let me quickly get rid of my laser pointer, otherwise you might get confused. Doesn't want. I can also speak with it, doesn't matter. I mean, at the end of the day, it's very important that just to understand a bit the kind of process here, right? So there is, consultation is not a must-have, right? It's nice to have. At the end of the day, it's a template which you need to fill out with the different kind of important components. How does the DIGA work? Which kind of evidence do you have? Where is it available? A lot of data security, etc. We have a few slides on that as well later on. It goes to the BfArM. The BfArM is then deciding within 3 months. So it's a maximum of 3 months. It's not in potentially 3 months. It's exactly 3 months time. Within that 3 months time, they're evaluating. If they have further questions, they are coming back to the company. You could further submit other documents which might be missing. And after that 3 months, and there's the decision if your product would be applicable for the DIGA registry. The interesting part, and I will just move, I think, one slide further, because then I can show it to you with the, I think, more interesting part, which is the preliminary inclusion in the DIGA registry, is when you follow that kind of pathway. You see the application, the blue box on the left-hand side. I have just started, and that's the decision. And if you as a company is or has applied for the inclusion as a preliminary inclusion, meaning that there is a hint that there is a benefit for your product. For example, sometimes you have a single arm study with only a few patients. I think we have seen that 12, 15, 20 patients were enough, even independent of the country, but there's a kind of sign that the DIGA helps the patient in one of the components I have just said beforehand. And then the BfArM could say, you could be included for 12 months in the DIGA registry. Within those 12 months, you have one, the opportunity, and one, the kind of, let's still call it the complexity, right? The complex part is you need to run a study in the German context for 12 months, which then needs to be resubmitted basically to the BfArM. And you see on the right-hand side here also possible extension up to 12 months. It's just important to keep in mind the study design needs to be set up for 12 months. If you then, for example, have an issue in terms of recruitment or anything like that, then you can extend it for another 3 months. And this is then up to 24 months. Within that 24 months, and this is really the interesting part, you have full reimbursement. This is the opportunity, right? Full reimbursement for the price you want to charge. No price negotiation, no kind of Complaints could be, I think you just to open the newspapers, and every health insurance company, health politician is a bit complaining about the high prices, which I think is just part of the negotiation, so just forget about it. But every health insurance company needs to pay for it, what you want, right? This is the important component. Once the BfArM has then received the full package, so the full evidence of the study we have just spoken about, the BfArM is again deciding, and if it's sufficient, then the product would go into the permanent registration, which would also mean that 3 months after the permanent registration, the price negotiations would then start. The price negotiations would then not be done by the BfArM. The BfArM is a registration body, so it's more for let's say the kind of from an access perspective, the very early stages, right? It's really more the kind of risk-benefit discussion, but it's then being done with the head association of all of those health insurance funds, what I have just shown you before. So at the end of the day, the interesting part is really once you get into that preliminary listing, you could be basically have reimbursement with a free pricing, and the price negotiation would just, let's say, start somewhere between 15 months or even more after you have launched the product. I think this is, what especially health politicians who have, let's say, negotiated that, have taken that as one of the big benefits from an industry and innovation perspective from the drug route, what we also have in Germany, where you also have the free pricing after launch, why the product is being assessed. So requirements, I've just spoken about very quickly and very briefly. Principal requirements which need to be fulfilled is quite clear: security, functionality, the quality of the product, right? Data protection, data security, according to state of the art. And here it's also very important to also check, let's say, every, 3-4 months, basically the kind of website by the BfArM, because they are adapting as well here and then a bit, or let's say not even adapting, I would say being a bit more precise over time as well in terms of data security and what needs to be then fulfilled with that. This is the standard, right? This is the must-have in any way. And then you have basically the kind of 2 boxes, what I have just said. For permanent inclusion, our application, you would need to have ready not only a kind of trend and a kind of idea and a hint towards an added benefit, but you need to have the positive care effects already being proven, right? By normally randomized clinical trials. The important things here also, we're not speaking only about medical benefits. So for example, it's not a must that you need to show, for example, an overall survival benefit or a pain reduction or anything like that. You could also show an effect on the improvement of patient-relevant processes. So for example, if you have, let's say, a pathway of a patient and you make that more easy, or you add, let's say, further, let's say, learning skills on the disease area, which would then potentially have as well a positive impact on the daily life of the patient. This could also be a kind of positive benefit and a positive effect, which would be agreed and accepted by the BfArM. Preliminary application, I've said already, I think the quite clear and quite logic justification, but I think the even more important thing is then what I put in here on the right-hand side in the lower box is then the scientific evaluation concept. So once you submit for a preliminary application, you would need to show, look, here is my kind of, let's say, suggestion for the added benefit, but here is also how the study would look like, what we're currently running. Let's call it the DiGA study. And that is then also what the BfArM is evaluating and giving you feedback if this might be acceptable for a full application, and obviously afterwards an acceptance. Oopala, a little bit too fast. Okay. So specification of positive care effect. I think it's again, it might be, and sometimes it's really kind of small things here, right? But it's really important, for example, to specify your patient group. For example, the indication. We had companies who were just saying, we are working in cancer. Yes, from a logical perspective, I agreed that this idea of that DIGA, it was a DIGA, or it is a DIGA, might have positive impacts for all cancer patients. But quite clearly, let's say turn that a bit, from an evidence perspective, it's very difficult to show that it really worked or works in all indications. So that is why you at least need to be at the very early beginning, start with one specific indication, right? By just saying, for example, breast cancer, or in pain, you need to be very precise. Is it maybe, I don't know, back pain, or is it other kind of areas which might be then specified, obviously, by ICD codes. Important is also then, this is linked to each other, right? I mean, the positive care effect, you need to be very careful how you then also define in your clinical trials your inclusion-exclusion criteria. That you don't, let's say, niche yourself, or that you don't, on the other hand, that you don't have it too large, too broad, that you might not be even able to, let's say, show a bigger benefit of the indication. I think it's a kind of normal, let's say, I would say planning side when you run a clinical trial. I think from a reimbursement perspective, I said that already, it's quite clear. I mean, the indication you include in your application is then the one where also you get the full reimbursement, the free pricing, what I mentioned beforehand, and the ICD code I've already mentioned when I was speaking about the indication on the slide, on that slide. When you think about your studies, when you think about your study to run, it's very important that, hold on, I only see myself, that you only focus your clinical trial in the German-speaking market a lot of times. If this is not the case, and we had it, I mean, we fought that, let's say, fight at least once, where we have been quite successful, but only after 3 consultations with the BfArM, where the product, or let's say the trial was run in France, was a full RCT, good number of patients, and the product has even shown overall survival benefit. And the BfArM said initially that's not acceptable because it was run in France, which didn't really make a lot of sense to us. So I think the important point is here, basically, if you don't want to run a trial in Germany, maybe in brackets, Switzerland, Austria is also be seen as, let's say, acceptable, then you would at least need to show that the care context in the country where the study was run is very similar. So for example, you can show that by standard, by standard guidelines, right? How are guidelines basically being written? Is that very similar? You could also show that by real life data, for example, if that's available, right? How patients are being treated, these specific patients. I think in our context with the example I have just said beforehand, we have just simply shown that the guidelines between the 2 countries, in this case, it was France and it was Germany, was very, very similar for that very specific part of the patient journey. And that is why, and where the BfArM has also changed, as said, in 3 consultations. So it took us really a while to turn that, to say, okay, in that way, it's probably sufficient. So the only thing what the company then needed to submit is not a full RCT. It was only a language validation, because there were obviously questions which are asked then in that DiGA to the patient. It's around complications, etc., where they have then needed to submit a language validation of the German question, so that this is basically showing the same thing which has been used in France, but obviously the German patient also understand it, right? This is also the reason why trials are, let's say, strongly preferred to be run in Germany, in Austria, and or in Switzerland. Further requirements, I think, or let's rather say, which kind of study types might potentially be more, let's say, seen. It's also important to keep in mind the regulation of the law doesn't say that the evidence needs to be shown with an RCT. But at the end of the day, if we have a look on the currently accepted DiGAs, they have all shown RCT evidence, or the ones which have been accepted preliminary, they are now all running randomized controlled trials. So that's maybe where it's, I think maybe also the industry behind, right, is pushing that a bit into that perspective. I think from an evidence perspective, I think it's good, it makes sense. Whether it always makes sense for the individual cases needs maybe also to be discussed. It's just important if you have, for example, maybe heard a bit about the GmbH, the Joint Federal Committee in Germany, which is normally one of the core decision makers in the system. They are pretty much always looking for RCTs. The BfArM is different. The BfArM, we had already as well discussions where we have been able to discuss more broadly, more openly about different endpoints, but also about the study design itself, where they also just said, look, in 12 months, a full RCT to prove what the DIGA might really show as a benefit is maybe a bit difficult. So we're still, let's say, in discussions there. I have to as well admit the company has not yet decided if they do not want to rather run an RCT in order to be on the very safe side. I mean, otherwise, expert opinions, expert reports are not, let's say, accepted and acceptable. But ultimately, it's important if you have a good and convincing evidence package. This might also be something what the BfArM is then discussing with you in detail. This is the clinical part, right? We have as well, which is also a big portion of that, is the IT requirements. And what you see here on the right-hand side is just a screenshot because this part of we will have two annexes here on, let's say, data protection security plus interoperability and some other IT requirements. We have just translated that because then it's a bit easier. Let's say, again, I like that kind of, let's say, duality, right? With the complexity and opportunity here, the complexity is because it's a bit more than 150 detailed questions. So it's really, let's say, hard work as well to go through it. And a lot of times, obviously, for the IT department of the DIGA or from the, let's say, development department of the DIGA companies. But it's also important just to say those 150 detailed questions can be answered basically with a yes or no. And if there is maybe, it depends obviously on the question, let's say the direction that the BfArM would say, oh, for example, a no is not that great, then there's also the opportunity to explain it, for example, because obviously sometimes not everything makes a lot of sense, even that, let's say, in general, the kind of, let's say, answer is making sense to that. So how does the BfArM directly looks like? It's also available in English, by the way. So it's a really simple kind of platform. You see that screenshot here. We have now 22 apps already, let's say, included, a bit more than a year now, 1.5 years roughly. I think the disease areas, I think at least to me, is not that surprising. We have, roughly 50%, 45% in mental and behavioral disorders. And then we have a good proportion of the disease of the nervous system. And then you can probably take as well neoplasms and endocrine metabolic diseases with each, 9%. The rest of it is still, let's say, quite not that, let's say, well characterized here. How many submissions? That's also the questions, right? I mean, 22, is that bad? Is that good? We have quickly compared it with the drug process, which has, let's say, as well been launched and changed in Germany roughly now 11 years ago. And I think the number of accepted positive cases in the drug area was quite similar. I think we had also somewhere around 9 or 10 in the first year, maybe a bit more. And I think after 1.5, 2 years, we had as well somewhere around 30 to 35 assessments. And I think this is basically very much what you see also in the DIGA area here. Even though you see that we have even 97 to roughly 100 applications as of October 6th this year. 72 of those were for preliminary inclusion, 25 for permanent inclusion. Interestingly is here, obviously, when you see the in the middle row, the 46 which have been withdrawn. 46 withdrawn is obviously a very high number, but I can also tell you, and that's, I think, really the kind of homework, if you have a company or if you think you might have, let's say, somebody in mind who has a DIGA and might potentially then expand potentially then into the German market as well, it's very important that you have a high quality documentation of your clinical evidence. I think this is most of the times the biggest issue. So you need to have a full protocol. Protocol needs to be obviously prospectively being written before the study, a statistical analysis plan, and even more important, a full clinical study report, obviously with the kind of, let's say, quality aspects, which are, let's have a look what, for some drug companies are doing. This is the kind of standard what the BfArM is applying to that, to those companies. So it's not that they have said it's not a DIGA or listen, it's not good enough. The vast majority of times, we also had some cases where we told them beforehand, but they wanted to hear it from the BfArM, where they just said, that's not enough from a documentation perspective. Okay, then we have Out of those 22, we had 5 DiGAs which were permanently listed. I mean, as already said a couple of minutes ago, they were basically having most of the time even multiple randomized controlled trial evidence. That was, I think, one of the core drivers. Basically, all of those were run in the German care context. Interestingly, also, that is where I personally was quite surprised when the whole DiGA was started. The range of patients was even from very low numbers, so 56 thinking about the 2-arm study is a bit more than 20 in each arm, right? So 56 up to a bit more than 1,000 patients per study. So this is a quite huge range, which also shows that the study design and the quality of the study and the documentation is the core driver of the DiGA process, not so much the number of patients. Obviously, you need to show with those number of patients the benefit. If you might have a huge benefit, which could be seen with your DiGA, obviously you also need less patients. 17 DiGAs were obviously then 22 minus 5 is 17 as part of the preliminary listing. I think a lot what I have just said beforehand is as well be seen here. How about the price? Price is quite heavily varied. I think this is by the way, at least one DiGA is here missing if you just count it. That's my caveat here. I've just seen it this morning. My kind of mistake. If you want to have the full list, just send me a quick email. We can send it over. It's important here. That's why I'm mentioning it. We even now have a DiGA which has, let's say, launched the product with a bit more than 100 euros for a 30 days or so, for a month kind of period, which is obviously on the very low end of the whole kind of process. Where I just want to add here, because you also said it's politics or policy behind, this DiGA has been already available with different contracts by health insurance companies. So a good number of, let's say, experts, and I agree, and let's say I'm part of those, believe that this was as well pushed by the health insurance companies in order to bring further down the prices, because prices are somewhere between 200 euros up to 740 euros. Keep in mind, those are not yet negotiated prices, right? If you follow the kind of process, makes sense, because I think the process for the negotiation is just starting at the end, and only when you have, let's say, been included permanently. We have only 5 permanently included, and the first negotiations have now just been started this summer, so there are no results yet of those negotiations. Negotiations last for a maximum of 6 months. Keep that in mind, and normally you need those 6 months with 3 negotiation rounds, which should also be taken. So don't go the short way. It's quite obvious as well, because I mean, if you don't agree, let's say early on, you still have a longer time of free pricing. So I think also from an incentives perspective, it makes a lot of sense. I will not go into the details today on that, but there's also, let's say, quite clear, let's say, process, how the money flows, obviously, from the system, health insurance funds, to the DiGA provider. And I mean, we even started, that is why I just wanted to show it, because I still, I mentioned the fax machine at the early beginning. We still have paper prescriptions in the system, right? I think we will change it in the next 2 years, but we have the, let's say, opportunity also for, let's say, the different patients, right? You could call them up, you could send a fax, you could, let's say, have paper prescription, or you even have rarely, but you have the first e-prescription as well, which all go, let's say, the same pathway, but obviously something as well keeping in mind from a programming IT perspective, because this as well needs to be implemented before launching the product then in Germany. So as a conclusion, I think, and I would agree with, I think, Yoav, what you have said, the DiGA pathway for me is also an attractive and especially rapid market access pathway, because I think if you're a DiGA, you could directly, even if you don't have, let's say, a full and strong evidence base at the time of launch, you could go into the kind of process and convince the B fund to be included. You have a quite long process and time with the free pricing, and you have as well, let's say, quite good examples already in the market where you can also have a look, for example, which different, let's say, strategies, especially maybe from an evidence perspective, worked. From a pricing perspective, we need to probably wait another, I would say, 6 to 8 months to get the first results out of the price negotiations, but that might be the next interesting pathway for the DiGAs. Good. That was my kind of speech. Thank you again. Thank you also, Mirel, for organizing. And I would like then to hand over to you in case there might be Any questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you for coming today. I'm glad we were able to do this webinar with all of the panelists and bring this value to everyone who's listening today and will be watching the recording in the future. Also, some people asked during the webinar, there will be a recording. We will be sending it by email to everyone who registered on the Zoom link. So there is the email listing, and also it will be published on the YouTube channel of Mars. So we have some questions. Everyone is welcome to also write their questions while we answer the ones we have. I'll start with one of mine. From your current experience with the DIGA reimbursement pathway, what would you suggest that the Israeli regulators will do about, especially about defining digital health for reimbursement?
I think, I mean, obviously, again, I need to admit, I'm not an expert in terms of Israel healthcare system, right? But I mean, what I have just heard from Shomrat beforehand, I think they are quite interesting, and I would say not too unsimilar kind of pathway, right? With pilot programs and those kind of things, where I think at the end of the day, this could basically be, let's say, potentially even combined in a way, right? I think the interesting part, and that's maybe the more question back, is if the product is, for example, already, let's say, reimbursed through that kind of pilot phase, because I think this is especially for startups, obviously a very interesting kind of pathway that you just say, look, I mean, we only need to invest part of it just to show, let's say, that it works, what we want to show, and then you can basically already launch in a way, and while you have the product on the market, you run in parallel your kind of study, which I think it's a kind of, it's probably a bit more than a pilot program, right? But at the end of the day, it's a very similar kind of, let's say, idea behind, right? Just prove it. So that's maybe a kind of, suggestion. I don't know.
Thank you. Okay, so moving forward to some of the questions from the people. Does Germany have an equivalent of the US Medicare for those who are retired?
A simple answer, no. But the good answer is basically that, let's say, we don't have really such a kind of, let's say, difference for patients once they have retired. I mean, patients normally, let's say, have their health insurance and they can basically, let's say, change it whenever they want. But a lot of patients are basically just staying with their health insurance company also after they have retired. So most of the times they just have the same health insurances. Just keep in mind, we don't have really a lot of competition between the health insurance companies. Yes, we have a bit of more than 100 health insurances, but competition is really on the low end. That is also why, let's say, the kind of packages are very similar and patients don't have a big incentive to change.
I would say that even in Israel, there's also kind of a low competition effect between the 4 health funds in Israel. Even though they are all throughout the country and not maybe in some more counties or something like that. But the number of people, the percentage of people who actually move between one health fund and another is somewhere around the 2% a year. Wow. Even though you can do it with just signing a form on the internet. So it's technically very easy to do.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. Another question is, does a new product already need to be fully integrated with German healthcare record data standards before getting into a trial phase?
No, I mean, I think it's important probably as well here to split a bit between the processes, right? I mean, if you say, look, I mean, or let's say we have 2 options here, right? If you run your clinical trial upfront before you file with the B-Farm for DIGA inclusion, for example, full RCT, and you want to go with your full package sent to the B-Farm to go into the permanent pathway, it's a clear and easy, simply no, because this is the kind of experimental part still, right? I think where it's getting a bit more complex, and that is where I guess the question is coming from. What if you have the situation that you have, let's say, a hint that there's a benefit, not with an RCT, but that you then say, B-Farm has agreed, So you can launch, and at the same time, you have a clinical trial which is up and running, right? The clinical trial is independent of the availability on the market. So it's basically still where you can say, look, we have a clinical trial, for example, with 1, 2, 3 centers, and we recruit the patient to get in there. Recruitment might be maybe a bit of a challenge as well, right? Because it's also freely available, let's say, by the other physicians. But currently, we don't see an issue with that. But coming back to the question, for the product which is then being available on the market, yes, then it needs to be integrated. But still, keep in mind, we still have a lot of fax machines. So a lot of the times, it's still more the kind of, let's say, must-have that once we're turning that into a full, let's say, hopefully full digital health sector as well, especially with the physicians, with GPs, etc., then you need to have the interoperability already given, but it's not yet that you need to prove it directly that it works.
Okay. Last question. So we'll finish on time. Are there also market access reimbursement pathways for remote patient monitoring, which don't require the active patient involvement in Germany?
Yes, so this is basically the kind of, let's say, direction, what I said early on, what if you are not a DIGA, right? There are pathways, yes. I mean, I think there is a quite prominent one, let's say, which is more called the methods evaluation pathway, where you also have the opportunity then to consult the Joint Federal Committee, the GmbH, what I mentioned beforehand, but that's then also where you need to have basically the full reimbursement, the full evidence package already available. There is also, for some very few cases, a so-called experimental coverage opportunity, which is again more going, I guess, where the pilot phase is also going to, where if the GmbH agrees that your product would need to go through that pathway because there's a hint for benefit, but not yet enough evidence, and the GmbH wants to support it, then the GmbH pays for that clinical study, but only for those patients which are then obviously included and recruited in that study. So there are those two, let's say, standard pathways. And then finally, there's the third one, what I mentioned earlier on as well, which is then the selective contracts directly with the health insurance funds. But I mean, I think I just see the question as well, Mirel. Andrea, I think if you have that, let's say, or if you need some more specific, send me a quick email and I can send you some links. Or also I can obviously explain it to you separately if you want.
Okay. Thank you first for all the speakers, okay, from all of our partners, from Shomrat from the Innovation Authority, Yoav from HealthIL, and of course, Dr. Stefan Walzer from Mars. Thank you all for coming today. We, the partners, we hope that this webinar will help the discussion of digital health regulation in Israel and help Israeli digital health startups in Germany and in Israel. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you. Bye.